Hi, I'm Sue Piccolini, and I'm delighted that you're listening to what our company has to offer to you as a new or a re-entry agent. When I started with this company in 1974, I suddenly realized that I didn't know too much about selling real estate, and so I looked for a company that gave training. This company started out being a training company, and we have continued that tradition. In fact, in the year 2000, after having a very successful career, being the president of a local association, a director for the California Association of Realtors and National Association, Mr. Mulhern said, "You're too young to retire. I want you to come and work with me on an updated training program." Well, I could remember back all those years before what I felt was most important to me. Most important to me was the paperwork. Didn't like doing it, tell you the truth, but I understood that that would be the footmarks that would determine whether this transaction was going to be good, smooth, or wrought with difficulties. And so I told Mr. Mulhern, I want to do the training for our contracts, for our disclosures, and for the paperwork. And so today, thank you for being here, in module number 5, we're starting out with the residential purchase contract. Now when I say the residential purchase contract, that we're going to be here for the entire seminar would take 6 hours. Don't worry, I'm not keeping you that long. But one of my agents said to me, 6 hours? What are you going to do in 6 hours? You only have 10 pages of the contract and maybe a few other things. And I said, well, what we're going to do is what so few agents take advantage of. We're going to know the contract. We're going to know what the contract does and does not do. And the agent representing their client who knows the contract is going to have the smoother transaction. Their clients are not going to be thrown off guard by something someone else says. And so what we're going to do is we are going to start with our contract going line by line, paragraph by paragraph, understanding the fullness of this contract. Well, the first thing you kind of need if you're going to be going through a contract and you want to make sure that you're representing your clients well, wouldn't it be good to know what your clients want? And so I usually have a little road map. This little road map tells me what kind of price they want to pay, who's going to be on title, what are the details of the property, and what kind of loan they want. In fact, sometimes, we had a hiccup in the market a few years ago where people got into adjustable loans and they were uncomfortable with them after they found out after 3 years that loan was going to do some nasty things to them. And so our client today, which is Mr. and Mrs. Ramos, wants to have a fixed interest loan. Well, I can do that for you, Mr. Ramos and Mrs. Ramos, and I'll show you in the contract where we will have it in writing, so you don't have to look back and wonder whether that detail has been taken care of. Now, I know when we went through the property just yesterday to make sure that we understood what was in the property, what was not in the property, we were taking notes, and we're going to make sure that those get into our contract. What I like to have agents do is to pack the contract with everything they want for their client in the contract. It reduces negotiation as we go along. Let's get some of those things taken care of. And so what did Mr. and Mrs. Ramos want? Well, first of all, they were looking at that pool and the pool house. They wanted to have permits on that particular piece of property. Saw those little sphinx-like things that we might see in Egypt. That probably indicates that we're going to have a termite problem here. And then looking up at the roof, there were some roofing materials that were missing or broken. And then the last thing is something subtle, and I hope all of you remember to look into this when you get into your first transaction, look at the property. Does the property have something very obvious that you and your client don't want to be left with after the transaction closes? I can tell you that when we get to close of escrow, Mr. Seller is going to have his things loaded in his car, and he's going to be driving down the driveway and the highway, and behind him may be some things that we should have taken care of ahead of time. And one of those things in this case happens to be an old, broken down, rusted playground set that was in almost the whole backyard, but Mr. and Mrs. Ramos didn't want that, and it looked like nobody had wanted it for a long time. And so we're going to get that in our contract to make sure that it is taken out before we do our final walkthrough. Another thing that came up is something they absolutely wanted to have. And what they wanted was a black Sub-Zero refrigerator. Well, let me give you a little background on a refrigerator. When I first got in the business, and probably the second year, I was writing a contract in a beautiful home that was in Lake Forest. Had a remodeled kitchen. It was all in blacks and marbles and what have you. And of course in the contract I put down that the refrigerator was to be included. Well, when the transaction closed, we got down to the property. I gave the owners their key. They went in, and I hear a shriek from the kitchen. "Sue, the refrigerator's not here." And I go in, and no, the refrigerator's not there. How could that happen? Well, went into the garage. The people had left us a refrigerator, but it wasn't that black Sub-Zero 2000 refrigerator. It was the one that they had used for beer and entertainment in the garage. So I'm going to let you learn from my mistakes. When you want it, name it and claim it in the contract so that the seller knows exactly what we're talking about. And so we're going to be putting that into our contract as well. Let's look into this contract just a little bit and see some of the key things that we want to make sure that we don't overlook and reasons for filling it in a certain way. Well, at the beginning of the contract, obviously, I'm going to be putting in the legal names of my buyers. That's the exact legal name. Some of your buyers would rather go by Skip or Homer or whatever it is, but we're going to go by their legal name. Another thing that the law is kind of funny on is that we are not to put down their relationship. We're not to put down that they're husband and wife, brothers and sisters, best buds or whatever. We leave that vacant, and we do not take on the obligation of deciding how they want that property to be vested to them. In other words, how they're going to take title. So with that in hand, we go through and outline what this property is, where it is, and we also include one of the most important things about the property identification. It's making sure that we have our property number, our parcel number, because that indicates in the whole state of California the exact piece of property that we are talking about. After that, it gets pretty easy. We put down that we want to have a 45-day escrow. 45-day escrow, okay. Well, does that include calendar days, or is that just business days? No, it's going to be calendar days. And the first day that we start counting after acceptance, that means everybody has accepted, signed on the dotted line, is that we count the next day. Not the day of acceptance, but the next day is our first day. And you wouldn't think that would be so important until you get to the end of the transaction, and everybody seems to want to move on the exact same day. And so we're going to go according to our contract and the way it was filled in. And of course, Mr. Seller is going to want to know about that deposit. How big is it? And when is it going to get to escrow? Well, in this case, on our piece of property, it's $450,000, and we're going to be putting a $15,000 deposit down. And we're going to put in our paperwork that we're going to get it to escrow within 3 days. What what if 3 days doesn't work for your buyer? Hopefully you've talked to them about it beforehand, but it turns out that the property that they decided they wanted to see and to make the offer on was what we call a drive-by property, which can have some problems. We have to make an offer blind on this piece of property, meaning that we need to make an offer and then see the inside of it. So we want to make sure that our deposit is ready to go, but we're not going to be putting it into escrow until we've done an interior inspection and approval. And I don't mean the full inspection that you're going to go through with an independent company. I'm talking about your buyers seeing the inside. And so we don't want to have a time that the money is going to be in escrow and the seller is drumming his fingers wanting to know when it's going to get there. It is the first place in our contract that actually favors the seller. In a market like this, you certainly don't want to have your buyers kicked out of a transaction when you had a difficult time finding a property for these buyers, to have them kicked out at the beginning. You know, sellers are looking at contractual obligations, and they're looking at the first one that your buyer is going to be doing is going to be getting that money into escrow. The second one, of course, is verification of their monies. So the things that we put into our contract that are tied to dates, we're going to know that they are known as calendar days, unless they happen to be part of our contract where a bank or an escrow company is not open, and then we're going to know that that would be business. And for business type of transactions, we cannot close on a Saturday, Sunday, or a holiday. And so taking that into consideration, a 45-day escrow may or may not land on one of those days that we cannot close it. What happens? Well, Mr. Seller's going to want to close early. Mr. Buyer says, no, it'll take some more time. Our contract says very specifically that our transaction will close the next business day. And so no one has to make that determination at the expense of someone else. Obviously, we'll have the terms and conditions of our loan financing situation, and we have something known as contingencies. For our buyers and even sellers, we have things known as contingencies that protect that person from having to go forward in the transaction until they have all the information that they want. And our usual contingency is going to have to do with the loan and the appraisal. It's kind of out of their hands what's going to happen. They have to go to a lender. We know they've been pre-approved, but still we need that lender in writing to put it down in black and white that these people are pre-approved, are going forward in order to get that loan. And so what is this contingency thing? It means that during that process of time, the buyer is doing his investigations, and Mr. Seller is waiting for, in most cases, that 21 days to pass. And then Mr. Seller expects that buyer to remove in writing that contingency. Actually, we cannot close a transaction with an open contingency. We're not going to let that happen. But we also know that our client is protected during that period of time, that they can take their time to make sure that they understand about this property. And so contingencies are important, and in this contract, we remove them by an active contingency format. That means that the client who's being protected is going to remove that contingency. Kind of interesting as you go through with all of the things that buyers need to satisfy for themselves, that we have those types of situations where a buyer should feel confident and comfortable when it comes time on that 21st, 22nd day that they will go ahead in writing, remove the contingency. But Sue, what if something bad happens? What if What if the man lost his job and he's not going to be able to afford to buy that house? Well, we have the right of cancellation in this contract. And in those two situations, when they have to cancel, our contract tells them very specifically that they will get their money back, that they will be signing cancellation on that property. So your clients, when you sit with them, should feel absolutely confident in going forward and making an offer on a piece of property. What happens if you've got a client doing it kind of in reverse order? How do we handle this situation? Does the contract help us in it? By a client doing it in the wrong order is a buyer who wants to make an offer on a piece of property and he still has a piece of property he needs to sell. In other words, his offer is going to be contingent upon him selling that piece of property. And so we're going to have a special form that we will fill in, and hopefully you'll understand that that form can be filled in from a buyer's perspective or from a seller's perspective. And that's why I tell you, you need to know the contract. If you are representing only sellers, you better know the contract, because your seller is relying on you in order to protect him in the process of this transaction. Obviously, most of you here today knew that we were going to be doing the purchase contract, and so most of you are probably thinking you're handling buyers. And we want to make sure that when we're handling our buyers or our sellers, that we know the control of the contract. The person who doesn't know the control of the contract sometimes ends up having a very dissatisfied client and perhaps no future business from that. So in our contract, we will be making sure that we can take care of that. Can we take care of some other things in our contract that may be problematic for our client? Well, we talked about what our client was worried about. He's worried about permits on that pool and that pool house. So we're going to put it in paragraph 6. Well, there's nothing really in there, just says other terms. We're going to put that Mr. Seller needs to supply those permits within 7 days after acceptance. We're going to put in our contract, because of those little things that are on the patio and around the house. Looks like something had been eating at it, better known as probably termites. We're going to say, Mr. Seller, we want you to provide a termite inspection, and I want you to include the pool house, and I want you to complete the section 1 and do the termite, if any, and give a final completion certificate. Talking about that play equipment. Well, the play set in the rear yard is to be removed. By when? By the final inspection. That's not at the close of escrow. That is by the final inspection. And then, of course, there I have my refrigerator. There's another place in the contract where it says, include all refrigerators. I'm sorry. I was bamboozled by a refrigerator one time. It's not going to happen to my clients now. So name it and claim it, and I would put it in here, is that the black Sub-Zero refrigerator 2000 to be included in the sale. You often wonder who is going to be paying for the cost, and some people say, well, it's always going to be the seller. Not always the seller, but many, many times in selling a piece of property, a seller will have many costs in it, and they are listed in our contract. So Mr. Seller doesn't have to wonder, well, who's paying for that? We're going to fill in our contract showing who will be doing that. If Mr. Seller's not happy with doing any of those things, what does he get to do? Well, hopefully he thinks long and hard before he decides that he's going to have to give a counteroffer. What are you doing that for? Because anytime your offer is presented to a seller and he chooses that he wants a little change to it, maybe a little higher price, maybe limit the amount of termite repair to a certain amount, anytime he does that, he has torn up our original, excuse me, our original contract. And so Mr. Buyer doesn't have to continue in the transaction. He now is free to go off and find another house. We don't want that to happen, of course not. And I think sometimes agents, even you that are new, don't realize that. You just kind of expect that counteroffer is going to happen. Look long and hard with your seller whether you're going to give a counteroffer or not, because it basically stops that first offer from ever happening. And yes, we do have forms, very specific forms, that we'll be using in order to have the counteroffer taken care of. How about those things that are in the property? You've heard about them, you've heard about fixtures, and you've heard about personal property. Do you know which fixtures are supposed to stay? All of them are supposed to stay. Do you know about personal property? Yes, our contract takes care of it. Well, okay, let's see what it does say. Note to the buyer and the seller. Items listed as included or excluded in the multiple listing service, on Channel 7 News, in flyers or marketing materials are not included in the purchase price or excluded unless specified here in our contract or in a counter to our contract. And so consequently, Mr. Seller needs to understand we expect all of these things to be included that are fixtures. Also, Mr. Buyer needs to understand some things may not be included. When I started, I used to think, well, it has to be in the contract. If something's excluded, and if I don't put it in the contract, then probably it's going to be included. Wrong. Buyers during the period of time that they're in a transaction sometimes get amnesia. And so if you've got something that's excluded from sale, put it in your contract. Put down that, for instance, the dining room light fixture is not included. Well, is your buyer happy with that, or does he have one that's nicer? In that case, you might want to put in your contract, and buyer will replace it after the close of escrow. Or perhaps the buyer says, hey, I should have a light fixture. Most houses have those. Okay, Mr. Seller, what do you want? Do you want to have, Mr. Buyer, what do you want to have happen? Do you want to have that seller replace that dining room light fixture? Hate to tell you, but probably the ding and dent super sale down at Home Depot or whatever is going to be where that light fixture is going to come from. Perhaps, maybe think about it, maybe you'd like Mr. Seller to credit you a certain amount of money so that you can replace that after the close of escrow. Onward to something that is really important to all of our buyers and sellers is going to be, when do we get possession of the property? In fact, that's the next most asked question when you're going through the contract. When do we get to move in? Well, there's going to be two kinds of property. Mr. Buyer, I know you want to live there with your family. So it's got to be a property that's in one of two states. One of the states would be that it's vacant. No one is in the property when we close the transaction, and we will show in our paperwork that at 6 o'clock on the evening that that particular property was recorded into the name of our buyer. They can go ahead and move into the property. But a lot of sellers don't move out of the property until they have that check in their hot little hand. And at that point in time, then they call the moving company, they get ready to go. And usually they'll tell us through the multiple listing service, or their agent will say, you know, Sue, we're going to need 3 days after the close of escrow for the move-in of your buyer. Well, that's just a tiny little bit of what is in this 10-page document. And when I see you next time, we'll go into some of the pre-printed things that you really need to know about, because I can tell you that your buyer is probably not going to read every single line. But we want to make sure our buyers know every single line.